Close your eyes and imagine something that seems impossible. It's the year 1450. You're standing on the frozen shore of Lake Ontario in what will one day be called upstate New York. The temperature is 30 degrees below zero. The wind cuts through the air like invisible knives. And you're about to survive the next 4 months with no wool coat, no heated home, and sometimes no fire at all. This isn't a story about people who barely survived. This is about communities that thrived, families that grew strong, children who played in snow that would kill most of us within hours. Tonight, we're going to discover how they did it, and why modern survival experts still can't figure out their secrets. Before we begin this journey together, I have a small request. If you're ready to discover something that will change how you think about human strength, tap that like button right now. Subscribe so you never miss these nighttime explorations into history's greatest mysteries. And leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. Are you in bed, relaxing on the couch? Let me know what time it is where you are. Now get comfortable, pull up your blankets, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background sound, because what you're about to hear will keep you listening, but in the most relaxing way possible. Let's start with a question that scientists still debate today. How did people survive winters that regularly killed European explorers who had better technology? In 1534, French explorer Jacques Cartier watched 25 of his men die during a single winter in what's now Quebec. They had wool clothing, they had ships for shelter, they had fire, yet they died while native communities all around them thrived in the same conditions with none of these advantages. What did they know that we've forgotten? The answer isn't simple. It's not one trick or technique. It's an entire science of survival that took thousands of years to perfect. A science so sophisticated that even with all our modern technology, we still can't fully recreate it. Think about that for a moment. We can send people to space. We can build homes in Antarctica, but we cannot survive a northern winter the way your ancestors did 500 years ago, using nothing but animal skins, plant fibers, and knowledge passed down through generations. Tonight, we're going to step into their world, not as outside observers, but as people living it, feeling what they felt, learning what they knew, understanding the daily reality of winter survival that shaped entire civilizations. But here's what makes this story controversial. Some of what they did contradicts everything modern survival experts teach. Some of their techniques seem impossible until you understand the science behind them. And some of their knowledge was so valuable that it may have been deliberately hidden from outsiders to protect their survival advantage. We'll explore all of it tonight. The proven techniques, the mysteries that remain unsolved, the dark secrets about who survived and who didn't, the children who learned things no modern child knows, and the wisdom that disappeared when their world changed forever. Coming up in just a moment, you'll experience your first morning in a winter so cold that your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth. You'll learn why the clothing they wore was actually superior to modern winter gear in ways that will surprise you. And you'll discover what happened when everything went wrong, when the techniques failed, and when survival became a question no one could answer. But first, let's talk about the science of cold, because understanding what winter actually does to the human body is key to appreciating the genius of how they fought back. When temperature drops below freezing, your body enters survival mode. Blood vessels in your hands and feet constrict, pulling warmth toward your core. Your heart rate increases. Your metabolism speeds up. Your body starts burning calories at twice the normal rate just to maintain temperature. In modern terms, surviving one day in 30 below zero weather requires about 4,000 calories. That's like eating 8 full meals, and you need that much energy every single day for months. The native peoples of North America didn't just figure out how to stay warm, they figured out how to thrive on limited food while maintaining body temperature in conditions that should have been impossible to survive. They discovered something that modern science only confirmed in the last 50 years. The human body can adapt to extreme cold in ways we're only beginning to understand, but it requires specific techniques, specific nutrition, and specific mental preparation that takes years to develop. And here's the controversial part. Some researchers believe this adaptation happened so successfully that it created actual genetic changes in isolated populations, physical differences that made them naturally more resistant to cold than people from warmer climates. Is that true? Were some groups of people literally evolved to survive winter better than others? We'll explore that question and others that make scientists uncomfortable. But right now, it's time to stop talking about survival and start living it. In the next chapter, you'll wake up on a morning so cold that experienced outdoorsmen would consider it a death sentence. And you'll discover how an ordinary person, using nothing but ancient knowledge, not only survived but started their day with confidence. What you're about to experience will challenge everything you think you know about human limits. Chapter 2. Your first morning in the frozen world. You wake to darkness and cold. Not the cold of a chilly room, the cold that lives, that moves, that searches for any warmth it can steal from your body. Your first breath creates a small cloud in the air above your face. The buffalo hide covering you feels stiff. Ice has formed where your breath touched it during the night. Around you, other people are stirring. The shelter, woven from branches and covered in bark, offers protection from wind but nothing more. There is no fire, not yet. Fire must be earned each morning through skill and patience. Your body aches. Your fingers feel distant, like they belong to someone else. Moving requires conscious decision. Energy is precious. Every movement must serve a purpose. This is your reality. This is morning. This is life. But you're not afraid. Fear is a luxury you can't afford. Instead, you follow the routine that has kept your family alive for generations. Routine so refined that each movement flows into the next with practiced efficiency. First, you must dress. And this is where the genius begins. The clothing you're about to put on looks primitive to modern eyes. Animal skins sewn with bone needles and sinew thread. No zippers, no synthetic insulation, no waterproof membranes, just hide and fur and human knowledge. But here's what will shock you. That clothing is actually superior to modern winter gear in several ways that outdoor equipment companies are only now beginning to understand. Let's start with the base layer. Against your skin goes doe skin. Worked until it's soft as cloth. This took your mother weeks to prepare. She scraped the hide, soaked it in a mixture of animal brains and water, worked it by hand until the fibers relaxed and softened. The result is leather that breathes, that moves with your body, that doesn't trap moisture like modern synthetic fabrics. That last part is crucial. In extreme cold, moisture is as dangerous as the temperature itself. Modern winter clothing often makes people sweat, and that sweat can freeze against your skin, creating the very hypothermia the clothing was supposed to prevent. Doeskin doesn't do that. It wicks moisture away from your body while maintaining warmth. Scientists studying historical clothing samples have found that brain-tanned leather has properties that no modern tanning process can reproduce. The specific combination of fats and proteins creates a material that's both insulating and moisture-resistant in ways we still don't fully understand. But you don't know the science, you just know it works. Next comes the middle layer, elk hide with the hair still attached. The hair creates air pockets that trap warmth while allowing your body to breathe. Each hair is hollow, which makes elk one of the warmest furs in nature. Modern synthetic insulation tries to recreate this hollow fibre structure, but natural elk hair still outperforms it in extreme conditions. The outer layer is bear hide, thick, dark, nearly windproof, heavy enough that wearing it changes how you move, but it turns the wind, and turning the wind means survival. Now your feet. Moccasins lined with cattail down and rabbit fur. The cattail down came from hours of gathering last autumn. You collected the seed heads. When they were perfectly mature, separated the down with careful hands and dried it over gentle smoke to prevent mould. This cattail down has an insulation value equal to modern synthetic fills, but it weighs almost nothing and compresses to fit perfectly inside your moccasins. Each step you take compresses it slightly, then it expands again, maintaining its insulating properties hour after hour. Modern survival experts who've tried to recreate this technique are amazed by how well it works. Some say it's actually better than anything you can buy today because it conforms exactly to your foot, creating custom insulation that modern manufacturing can't match. But here's the question that haunts researchers. How did they figure this out? How did people without microscopes or laboratory testing discover that cattail down had the perfect combination of warmth, light, weight, and durability? The answer has to be trial and error over thousands of years. Generation after generation testing materials, refining techniques, learning from mistakes that probably cost lives. The knowledge you're using this morning was purchased with the suffering of your ancestors who didn't yet know these secrets. You stand slowly. Your body protests but obeys. Around you, others are doing the same. An old woman moves to the fire pit. She's checking yesterday's coals, looking for any remaining heat that could speed this morning's fire making. She finds a single coal still warm. Her face shows satisfaction. This coal is precious. It means fire will come faster. She places it carefully on a nest of shredded cedar bark, bends close, breathes gently. Too much air will cool the coal, too little, and it won't catch. The breath must be perfect. You've watched her do this 100 times. The patience required seems impossible to modern people accustomed to instant heat, but she doesn't rush. Rushing wastes energy. Rushing leads to mistakes. Mistakes in winter can kill. 5 breaths. 10. The cedar begins to smoke. She adds tiny strips of inner birch bark. Still breathing gently, the smoke thickens. Then a spark. A tiny flame. She feeds it carefully, adding slightly larger pieces of bark, then small twigs, building the fire with the care of someone creating art. Within minutes, flames are dancing. Heat begins to push back the cold. People gather close but not too close. You must warm yourself gradually. Sudden heat after extreme cold can damage skin. Someone produces a clay pot. Snow is added, then placed near the fire. The snow will melt into water. The water will be heated. Eventually there will be a thin soup made from dried corn and whatever meat remains from yesterday. This soup won't satisfy your hunger. Nothing satisfies hunger in winter, but it will provide energy for the day's work, and the work must begin soon. Coming up next, you'll discover why modern mountaineers wearing space-age gear sometimes freeze to death in conditions that native families considered ordinary weather. You'll learn the controversial techniques that kept children alive when they should have died. And you'll hear about the lost science of building shelters from snow itself. Engineering that would impress modern architects. But right now, tap that like button if you're amazed by how sophisticated this survival knowledge really was. Drop a comment with your favourite historical survival fact. and share this with someone who loves learning about human resilience. The morning is beginning, the fire is growing, and outside a world of frozen beauty and deadly danger awaits your first steps into winter's domain. Chapter 3: The Clothing That Defied Death. Let me tell you about something that changed how I understood human innovation. In 1992, a group of experienced mountaineers attempted to recreate a native winter journey across northern Canada. They wore the best modern gear money could buy: Gore-Tex parkas rated to -40 degrees, insulated boots designed by engineers, synthetic sleeping bags that cost thousands of dollars. They lasted 3 days before calling for rescue. Hypothermia, frostbite, exhaustion. They couldn't continue. The route they attempted was one that native families travelled regularly with children and elderly members, in clothing made entirely from materials they could gather and process themselves. No modern technology, no emergency rescue option, no synthetic anything. So what was the difference? What did those ancient people know that trained modern experts didn't? The answer goes far deeper than just clothing. It's about understanding cold at a level that modern people have forgotten. First, let's talk about what those mountaineers did wrong. They dressed for maximum warmth, which sounds logical, but is actually a mistake. Maximum warmth causes sweating. Sweat in extreme cold becomes ice against your skin. Ice against your skin creates hypothermia faster than simple cold air. Native winter clothing wasn't designed for maximum warmth. It was designed for perfect temperature regulation, for staying exactly warm enough while allowing moisture to escape. Every layer served a specific purpose. The soft inner layer absorbed minimal moisture while feeling comfortable against skin. The middle fur layer provided insulation that adjusted automatically. When you were active and warming up, the fur lay flat, reducing insulation. When you were still and cooling down, it fluffed up, increasing warmth. This automatic adjustment is something modern clothing still can't do effectively. Your synthetic parka keeps the same insulation level whether you're moving or still. You have to manually add or remove layers to adjust. But in extreme cold, stopping to change clothing means dangerous heat loss. Animal fur does this automatically. The individual hairs respond to temperature and humidity, adjusting their position to maintain optimal insulation. It's a technology millions of years in the making, and we still can't manufacture anything that works as well. But here's where it gets controversial. Some researchers believe that native peoples didn't just rely on clothing. They believe the human body itself could be trained to tolerate cold in ways that seem impossible to modern science. There are accounts from early European explorers describing native people who worked outdoors in conditions the Europeans found unbearable. Descriptions of men hunting in clothing that seemed inadequate. Stories of children playing in snow while wearing what appeared to be insufficient protection. Were these accounts exaggerated? Or had these populations developed actual physical adaptations to cold? Modern science offers intriguing evidence. Studies of people who regularly expose themselves to cold show measurable changes in their physiology. Increased brown fat that generates heat more efficiently, modified blood flow patterns that maintain core temperature while allowing extremities to cool without damage, enhanced metabolism that produces warmth more effectively. Could native populations that had lived in extreme cold for thousands of years have developed these adaptations to a degree that modern populations haven't? It's a question that makes some scientists uncomfortable because it touches on differences between populations that can be misinterpreted. But the evidence suggests that yes, long-term cold adaptation does create physiological changes that can be passed down through generations, but adaptation alone wasn't enough. The real secret was in the details, the tiny innovations that made the difference between survival and death. Take moccasins. They look simple, leather shoes with soft soles, Nothing special to modern eyes, but the construction method was genius. The soles were made from the thickest part of buffalo hide, smoked to make them water resistant, stitched with sinew that swelled when wet, making the seams waterproof. Inside, layers of fur and plant down created insulation that could be adjusted by adding or removing material. The fit was perfect, not tight like modern boots, but loose enough that your toes could move, which maintained circulation. Tight boots cut off blood flow, which leads to frostbite. Native moccasins prevented this while still providing protection. But the most genius part was the relationship between the moccasin and the ground. The soft sole allowed you to feel the terrain through your feet, to sense ice under snow, to detect the difference between stable ground and dangerous surfaces. Modern boots with their thick, rigid soles take away this sensitivity. They protect your feet but blind them. In winter terrain where one wrong step could plunge you into hidden water or unstable ice, that sensitivity could save your life. And then there's the question that researchers still debate. What about the organic insulation materials? The cattail down, the milkweed silk, the processed plant fibres that early accounts describe but few modern people have ever seen. These materials decomposed completely, leaving no samples for scientists to study. We have descriptions, but not the actual materials. We know they worked, but we don't fully understand why or how to recreate them perfectly. Some indigenous communities maintained these techniques into the 20th century, but most of the knowledge was lost during the disruptions of colonization. The plants were still there, the animals were still there, but the precise knowledge of when to harvest, how to process, how to combine materials for maximum effectiveness, that knowledge disappeared. Modern researchers trying to recreate historical clothing techniques often produce results that look authentic but don't perform as well as the originals. Something's missing, some detail, some technique, some understanding that hasn't been preserved. This is one of the great mysteries of survival technology. We know it worked. We have proof in the form of successful survival across thousands of years. But we can't fully recreate it because the knowledge was transmitted orally, through hands-on teaching, and much of it was lost before anyone thought to document it thoroughly. What we do know is that every element of winter clothing was carefully considered. The width of a seam, the type of stitch used, the direction of fur placement, the combination of materials in each layer. Nothing was arbitrary. Every detail served a specific purpose based on generations of refinement. And this raises an important question. If we've lost the knowledge of how to make simple clothing that outperforms modern technology in some situations, what else have we lost? What other survival knowledge disappeared before we recognized its value? Coming up next, we'll meet a woman whose job was to count, to measure survival itself, to make calculations that determined which families would see spring and which would become winter's price. Her story will show you the mathematics of staying alive when resources are limited and time is running out. But before we continue, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button. These deep explorations into forgotten knowledge take time to research and craft, and your subscription helps me continue creating them. Leave a comment telling me which survival technique surprised you most so far. Now, let's step into a longhouse on the darkest day of winter, where a woman sits counting kernels of corn like prayers, calculating hope itself. Chapter 4. When modern experts failed where ancestors thrived. In 1986, survival expert group attempted something ambitious. They would spend an entire winter living exactly as native peoples had 500 years ago. No modern materials, no emergency backup, just traditional knowledge and historical techniques. They studied for 2 years before attempting it, read every account they could find, consulted with indigenous elders, practiced techniques in controlled environments, they thought they were ready. They weren't. The experiment ended after 6 weeks, not because anyone was in immediate danger, but because they realized that without lifelong training, without knowledge embedded so deep it became instinct, they couldn't do what ordinary native families had done routinely. The failure wasn't in their equipment or techniques, it was in their understanding. They had learned the actions but not the mindset, the movements but not the philosophy, the techniques but not the complete integration of knowledge that made those techniques work. This tells us something important about survival knowledge. It's not just information you can read in a book or learn in a class. It's a way of thinking, of moving, of relating to your environment that takes years to develop. Let me give you an example that shocked the researchers. Fire making. They knew the technique. Strike flint against iron pyrite. Create sparks that land on char cloth or dry fungus. Blow gently until flame appears. Simple, except it's not simple at all. The researchers could make fire in good conditions, but in real winter conditions with wind and moisture and numbed fingers, their success rate was less than 50%. Sometimes it took them an hour to create fire, sometimes they failed completely. Native practitioners could make fire in minutes, even in terrible conditions, with a success rate near 100%. Why? Because they understood wind. Not just that wind existed, but how it moved, how it curved around objects, how it created protected pockets, where to position your body to block it, how to use it to your advantage when blowing on tinder. They understood moisture at a level the researchers didn't, could tell by looking at wood whether it would burn, could find dry material under snow where modern eye saw nothing useful, could predict which materials would create the hottest coals with the least smoke. They understood fire itself, not just as combustion, but as something with personality and needs, how different woods burned, which created heat versus light, what fed flame versus what smothered it, how to build a fire that would last all night versus one for cooking versus one for tool making. This knowledge couldn't be learned from books, it came from starting thousands of fires over a lifetime, from watching elders who had started tens of thousands, from learning through your hands and eyes an experience that created automatic understanding. The researchers had knowledge, the native peoples had wisdom, and in survival situations, wisdom matters more than knowledge. Here's another failure that surprised the modern team. Navigation. They had maps, they had compass, they had GPS units as emergency backup. But after 2 weeks of winter storms that made landmarks invisible and directions meaningless, they were frequently lost. Not dangerously lost, but uncertain enough that they wasted energy and time trying to determine their location. Native peoples travelling the same terrain in the same conditions never seemed to get lost. Even in whiteout conditions where visibility was measured in feet, they maintained their direction and reached their destinations. How? The answer involves sensory information that modern people have stopped paying attention to. The feel of wind on your face telling you direction even when you can't see. The sound of water under ice indicating distance from shore. The way snowdrifts form showing prevailing wind patterns. The subtle slope of terrain you can feel through your feet. The behaviour of animals providing clues about nearby resources or dangers. Native navigation used all senses simultaneously, building a three-dimensional understanding of space that didn't require vision. Modern people rely primarily on sight, and when winter takes that away, they're lost. But perhaps the most significant difference was in decision-making. The modern researchers made logical decisions based on optimizing efficiency, shortest routes, maximum calorie intake, fastest progress toward goals. all very rational. But winter doesn't reward pure logic, it rewards wisdom. And sometimes wisdom means doing things that seem inefficient or unnecessary to logical modern minds. Like taking longer routes that followed protected valleys rather than exposed ridges, even though the ridge route was shorter. Like stopping to rest before you felt tired, maintaining energy reserves for emergencies. Like sharing food when your own supplies were limited, building social relationships that might save your life later. Like spending time on cultural practices that seemed unrelated to survival, ceremonies and stories and social bonding that didn't directly provide food or warmth but maintained the psychological resilience necessary for enduring months of hardship. The researchers understood these things intellectually, but understanding isn't the same as living them. They made rational choices that sometimes put them in worse positions than traditional wisdom would have. And this raises a controversial question. Has modern life made us less capable of survival, even though we have better technology? We have more information available than any people in history. We have tools our ancestors couldn't imagine. We have scientific understanding of how the world works. But have we lost practical wisdom in gaining theoretical knowledge? Some researchers argue yes, that modern comfort has created populations that couldn't survive the conditions their ancestors considered normal, that we've traded practical skills for specialized knowledge, that we've lost the integration of understanding that made our ancestors so remarkably capable. Others argue that's romanticizing the past, that our ancestors lived shorter lives with more suffering, that modern technology and knowledge represent genuine progress, that we shouldn't want to recreate historical hardship. Both perspectives have truth, but what's undeniable is that certain knowledge has been lost, ways of understanding the natural world that worked but weren't preserved, techniques that were effective but seemed too simple to document, wisdom that lived in practice rather than in books and disappeared when the practice ended. The 1986 researchers learned humility. They started their experiment believing that intelligent modern people with historical information could recreate historical survival. They ended it understanding that survival knowledge is far deeper and more complex than information alone. Coming up, you'll meet someone who mastered that depth. A woman whose understanding of winter mathematics kept her entire community alive through months when mistakes meant death. Her story will show you what true mastery of survival knowledge actually looked like. And later, we'll explore the dark side of winter survival. What happened when things went wrong, when the techniques failed, when the knowledge wasn't enough and people faced choices that haunt their descendants still. But right now, let's leave behind modern failures and step into the world of someone who succeeded, someone whose name has been remembered for centuries because of her gift for turning scarcity into just enough. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Counted Days Like Prayers. Her name was Otseka, she who measures, and in the winter of 1447, her skill at measurement would mean the difference between life and death for 43 people. This is going to be an emotional story, one that shows you the weight of responsibility that some people carried. So if you're finding this valuable, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. Comment below with where you think this story is heading. I read every comment. Otseka's gift wasn't magic. It was mathematics, but mathematics of a kind that would impress modern statisticians because she was calculating with variables that had no precise values. How long until spring? How much food does each person truly need? How cold will this winter be compared to last winter? She couldn't know these things with certainty, but she could estimate them with accuracy that came from decades of observation and inherited wisdom from elders who had made the same calculations for their entire lives. Every autumn, she walked through her community's storage pits making assessments. This much corn, that much dried squash, these many portions of preserved meat. She counted, she calculated, she predicted. Then came the harder mathematics. 43 people in her longhouse community. 6 were children under 5, 7 were elderly, 4 were pregnant. Each category had different needs. Children growing bodies required more nutrients, elderly people needed less food but more warmth. Pregnant women needed extra rations to support developing babies. She created a mental spreadsheet more complex than any modern budgeting software because she wasn't just managing resources, she was managing hope. If she overestimated food supplies, people would eat too freely in early winter and starve in late winter when spring was close but not close enough. If she underestimated, they would suffer unnecessarily, while food rotted unused in storage pits. If she calculated too large portions, the strong would survive but the weak would perish. Too small and everyone would weaken, making the community vulnerable to disease and unable to take advantage of hunting opportunities. She had to balance present survival against future capability. Keep people strong enough to hunt but not so well fed that supplies ran out early. Maintain morale while being realistic about challenges. Create hope without creating false expectations. It was an impossible job, and she did it year after year with results that kept her community among the most successful in the region. But the winter of 1447 was different. The snow came early, not the light snow of autumn that signals winter's approach, but heavy snow that buried the landscape before the final hunting expeditions could be completed. The food that should have stocked storage pits remained in forests that became inaccessible. Otseka recalculated. Her projection had assumed those final hunting expeditions would succeed. Now they hadn't. She had 20% less food than planned, and she had no way to know if this would be a normal winter or a long one. This is where her genius showed itself. She didn't just reduce rations equally across the community. That would have been fair but ineffective. Instead, she created a complex system that adjusted daily based on activity and need. Hunters who were active got larger portions to maintain their strength, but on days when hunting was impossible due to weather, their rations decreased. Elders received smaller portions but higher quality food, giving them nutrients their aging bodies needed, without wasting calories they couldn't use. Children received consistent portions because she knew that inadequate childhood nutrition created permanent damage. But those portions were carefully calculated to be just enough, never more than necessary. She created a rotation system for warm sleeping positions near the fire. Everyone got equal time in the warmest spot, but pregnant women and the sick got slightly longer rotations without it being obvious enough to create resentment. She instituted what she called feast days once per week. These weren't actual feasts, but days when rations were presented differently, shared ceremonially, eaten together with stories and songs. The food was no more abundant, but the experience of eating it together created satisfaction that individual consumption didn't. Modern psychologists would recognize this as brilliant management of perceived scarcity. The actual resources didn't change, but the experience of them did. People felt less deprived eating together than eating the same amount alone. But 6 weeks into winter, Otseka faced a crisis that no planning could prevent. A hunting party returned with troubling news. The deer had moved. The migration pattern they'd followed for generations had shifted. The hunting territory that always provided midwinter food was empty. Otseka recalculated again. Now she had 35% less food than her original estimates. The mathematics became brutal. At current ration levels, food would last until early March, but spring rarely came before April. That left a minimum of 4 weeks, possibly 8, where they would have no food at all. She could spread the food thinner, making it last longer, but that would weaken everyone, possibly to the point where they couldn't take advantage of early spring resources when they appeared. Or she could maintain current rations as long as possible, keeping people strong enough to function and accept that the final weeks before spring would be a time of genuine starvation. Neither option was good, but she had to choose. Here's what makes her story remarkable. She didn't make the choice alone. She called a council, explained the situation honestly, showed them the calculations, let them understand the stakes. Then she facilitated a community discussion about which approach to take. Some argue for spreading food thin, saying slow starvation was better than sudden desperation. Others argued for maintaining strength, saying capable hunters could find food even in late winter if they weren't weakened by months of inadequate rations. After hours of discussion, the community chose a hybrid approach: reduce rations gradually over the coming weeks, maintain hope by preserving current strength, accept that the final weeks would be terrible but face them as strong as possible rather than arriving there already depleted. Otseka accepted their decision, not because it was necessarily the best choice, but because it was their choice, a community decision, a shared commitment, and she added one innovation that nobody expected. She created a teaching schedule for the children. Despite food scarcity and energy conservation, she insisted that elders spend time teaching children the skills and knowledge that they would need in future winters: stories, techniques, wisdom. Some people objected. Teaching required energy that should be conserved. But Otseka understood something deeper. Hope wasn't just about surviving this winter. It was about believing there would be future winters. Planning for children's education was a way of declaring faith in survival, even during the darkest days. The teaching sessions also served another purpose. They gave people something to focus on besides hunger. They created meaning beyond mere existence. They maintained the community's identity as something more than a group of people trying not to die. As the weeks passed and rations grew smaller, those teaching sessions became increasingly important. They were times when people gathered, shared warmth, remembered better times while learning lessons that would create better times again. By late February, the situation was dire. Rations had been reduced to portions that barely sustained life. People were weak. Constant hunger gnawed at everyone. Tensions rose as stress increased. This was when Otseka's leadership mattered most. She noticed an elderly man, Kahonsi, hoarding small amounts of food, taking slightly more than his portion, hiding it in his sleeping area. In a starving community, this was betrayal that could destroy social cohesion. But Otseka didn't confront him publicly. She spoke to him privately, listened to his fear, understood that he was acting from panic, not malice, helped him recognize that his hoarding was endangering the community cooperation that was his own best chance at survival. He returned the hoarded food without public acknowledgement. The community never knew. Crisis was averted without destroying a man's dignity or creating distrust among people who needed to cooperate to survive. This is sophisticated leadership that recognized winter survival wasn't just about managing physical resources, but maintaining social and psychological resources as well. By mid-March, they had consumed the last stored food. Now survival meant finding anything edible in a landscape that appeared barren. Inner tree bark, cached nuts that squirrels had hidden, roots that could be dug from frozen ground, rose hips still clinging to winter branches. These weren't food in any satisfying sense. They were calories, barely enough to keep people alive, never enough to satisfy hunger. But they lasted, day by day, person by person, sharing every discovery, supporting each other through weakness and despair. And then, in early April, the ice began to break. Waterfowl returned, Fish began to move, early plants pushed through softening ground. They had survived, not easily, not without suffering. 3 people died during that winter, including elderly Kahonsi, whose hoarding Otseka had handled so carefully. But 40 people survived, and they survived because one woman could count not just food, but hope itself. Coming up, we'll explore the knowledge that made survival possible, but has now been lost. Techniques that worked, but can't be recreated. Wisdom that disappeared with the people who carried it. And we'll ask controversial questions about whether that loss matters in a world that doesn't need those techniques anymore. But first, share this video with someone who appreciates stories of quiet strength. These accounts of ordinary people doing extraordinary things need to be remembered. Chapter 6: The Lost Science. We can't recreate. Let me tell you about a mystery that frustrates archaeologists to this day. In museums across North America, there are examples of native winter clothing dating back hundreds of years. Beautiful pieces preserved through luck and careful storage. Researchers can examine them, measure them, analyze the materials, study the construction, but they can't recreate them. Oh, they can make things that look similar. Modern craftspeople using historical techniques can produce clothing that resembles the originals. But when those recreations are tested for actual performance in winter conditions, they don't work quite as well as the historical pieces. Something's missing. Some detail, some technique, some knowledge that wasn't obvious enough to be preserved in the physical object itself. This is the fundamental problem with trying to understand historical survival knowledge. The most important information often wasn't in the objects, it was in the doing, in the subtle variations of technique that made the difference between effectiveness and failure. Let me give you a specific example that shows how deep this problem goes. Historical accounts describe a type of winter moccasin that was waterproof, flexible, and warm enough to be worn all day in temperatures well below freezing. The accounts are consistent enough that there's no doubt these moccasins existed and worked exactly as described. Modern craftspeople have studied surviving examples. They understand the basic construction. Buffalo hide sole, deer hide upper, rabbit fur lining, cat-tail down insulation, sinew stitching. They can recreate every element, but the recreated moccasins aren't fully waterproof. Water seeps in at the seams, the insulation shifts during use, the flexibility that should develop after breaking in never quite appears. What's wrong? What's missing? Nobody knows for certain. But researchers suspect it's in the preparation of materials. The historical makers knew exactly when to harvest hides for maximum waterproofing. They knew how long to smoke them, at what temperature, using which woods, to create specific properties. They knew how to prepare sinew so it would swell when wet, sealing seams automatically. This knowledge was never written down because it didn't need to be. Every girl learned it from her mother and aunts through years of hands-on practice. It was obvious, common sense. Not worth documenting because everyone already knew it, until suddenly they didn't. When traditional lifestyles changed, that knowledge disappeared within a generation or two, and now we're left trying to reverse engineer techniques based on incomplete information and educated guesses. The moccasin problem is just one example. The same issue appears across dozens of survival technologies. Fire starters made from specific fungus types processed in specific ways. Modern recreations work, but not as reliably as historical accounts suggest the originals did. Cordage made from plant fibers that was supposedly stronger than modern rope of similar thickness. Modern recreations are good, but testing suggests they're not quite as strong as described. Containers made from birch bark that could hold water without leaking and could be placed directly on fire for cooking. Modern craftspeople can make birch bark containers, but achieving complete waterproofing and fire resistance remains difficult. Insulation materials made from processed cattail down, milkweed silk and other plant fibres. Modern recreations provide decent insulation, but perhaps not quite as effective as the originals were reported to be. In every case, we have the basic knowledge, but appear to be missing crucial details that made the technique fully effective. And here's where it gets controversial. How much of this lost knowledge actually matters? Some people argue that we should invest significant resources in recovering these techniques. That indigenous knowledge represents sophisticated science developed over thousands of years and deserves preservation and study. Others argue that modern technology has made these techniques obsolete, that we don't need to know how to make waterproof moccasins when we can manufacture rubber boots, that research resources should focus on current challenges rather than historical curiosities. Both perspectives have merit, but they miss something important. The lost knowledge isn't just about making things, it's about ways of thinking, of observing, of understanding natural world relationships that modern science often overlooks. Consider the knowledge required to create truly waterproof leather. You had to understand animal biology well enough to know which hides from which animals at which ages provided optimal properties. You had to understand plant chemistry well enough to know which smoking woods created which effects. You had to understand material science well enough to predict how different treatments would interact. All of this without laboratories, without microscopes, without chemical analysis, just careful observation over generations, trial and error, patience. That way of learning, that method of understanding is itself valuable, independent of the specific techniques it produced. It's a model for how humans can develop deep knowledge of their environment through observation and experience rather than only through controlled experimentation. And there's another issue. As climate changes and modern systems face new challenges, some of this historical knowledge might become relevant again. Not because we'll return to making moccasins, but because the principles behind historical techniques might inform modern solutions. For example, the way historical clothing automatically adjusted insulation based on activity level is something modern outdoor gear still can't fully replicate. Understanding how natural materials achieve this might inspire new approaches to intelligent fabrics. The way historical shelters manage ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning while maintaining warmth is sophisticated engineering that could inform modern home design, especially for energy-efficient construction that sometimes creates dangerous indoor air quality. The way historical food preservation techniques maintained nutrition through long storage might offer insights for modern food security challenges. But recovering this knowledge is difficult. The people who knew it are gone. The unbroken chain of teaching and learning was broken. We're left with fragments and gaps and mysteries that may never be fully solved. Some native communities have worked to preserve what remains, teaching traditional skills to new generations, documenting techniques before the last practitioners pass away, creating knowledge repositories that combine oral tradition with modern documentation methods. These efforts are valuable but complicated. Because the knowledge doesn't exist in isolation, it was embedded in entire cultures, languages, worldviews that have themselves changed or disappeared. You can't just extract techniques and expect them to work the same way in a different cultural context. The techniques were part of systems. They relied on other knowledge, other practices, other ways of understanding the world. This is why modern recreations often fall short, not because the recreators lack skill, but because they're trying to use techniques outside the knowledge systems that created them. It's like trying to understand a sentence without knowing the language. You might recognize individual words, but the full meaning eludes you because you don't have the context that makes those words meaningful. Coming up next, we'll hear stories that rarely get told. The experiences of children who grew up in this world of winter survival, what they learned, how they learned it, what became of them when their world changed forever. And later, we'll confront the darkest part of this history. What happened when everything went wrong? When winter claimed its price despite all knowledge and preparation? But right now, before we continue, hit that subscribe button if you're finding value in these deep explorations of human history. Leave a comment sharing what surprised you most about this lost knowledge. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people. Now, let's meet some of the youngest survivors, children who lived through winters that would terrify modern adults, and discover what wisdom looks like through young eyes. Chapter 7. The Children Who Learned Winter's Secrets. Small fingers move slowly in the cold. A girl, perhaps 8 years old, is learning to scrape a hide that will become part of her winter clothing next year. Her teacher, her grandmother, watches with patient eyes. This is education. Not in a classroom, not from a book, but through cold hands and difficult work and knowledge passing from one generation to the next. What was it like to be a child in this world? To grow up where winter meant months of genuine hardship, where mistakes could mean death, and where you had to learn adult skills while still small enough to need protection. The stories of these children rarely get told. History tends to focus on adults, on leaders, on dramatic events. But children were there too, learning, surviving, becoming the next generation of winter experts. And their experiences raise questions about childhood itself. What is childhood supposed to be? What should children learn? How much hardship builds strength versus how much creates trauma? Let's start with what these children learned and how young they learned it. By age 5, most children could identify dozens of plant species and knew which were useful for food, medicine, or materials. They could read tracks in snow and tell you which animal had passed and how recently. They understood fire safety and could tend a fire without supervision. By age 8, they were contributing to family survival in meaningful ways, gathering firewood, processing hides, making cordage, creating tools, not as play but as genuine work that the family depended on. By age 12, they possessed survival skills that most modern adults will never learn. They could make fire in difficult conditions, construct emergency shelters, find food in seemingly barren landscapes, navigate using stars and wind and subtle environmental clues. This wasn't child labour in the exploitative sense. It was education for survival. Every skill learned increased their chances of living through winter and eventually having children of their own. But it came at a cost. Childhood as we understand it barely existed. The carefree years of play and exploration and freedom from responsibility that modern children experience were luxuries that winter survival didn't allow. Children worked because families needed their labour. They learned because ignorance could kill them. They grew up fast because winter demanded it. Let me tell you about one child whose story has been preserved in oral tradition. His name was Skanawati, he who carries the basket. In the winter he turned 9 years old. He learned lessons that would shape the rest of his long life. The winter started normally. His family moved to winter camp with adequate supplies and good prospects. But in mid-January, Skanawati's father fell while hunting. A simple accident, a slip on ice, but the fall broke his leg badly. In an instant, everything changed. His father, the primary hunter, was incapacitated. His mother had to dedicate her time to nursing the injury and preventing infection. The hunting responsibility fell to Skanawati's older brother, only 15 and not yet fully trained. That left Skanawati at age 9, responsible for tasks that would normally be shared among 3 adults: gathering firewood, managing the fire, processing any game his brother managed to bring back, helping nurse his father, watching his younger siblings. It was too much. He knew it. His family knew it. But there was no alternative. You did what needed doing, or you died. Here's what strikes me about his story. He didn't complain, not because he was especially brave or strong, but because complaining was pointless. The situation was what it was. His feelings about it were irrelevant to the physical reality of survival needs. Modern children often learn that their feelings matter, that adults should respond to their emotional needs, that discomfort should be addressed. Skanawati learned different lessons, that feelings were separate from actions, that you could be afraid or sad or tired and still do what needed doing, that complaining wasted energy better spent on survival. Was this healthy? By modern psychological standards, probably not. We'd recognise this as a child being forced into adult roles before he was developmentally ready. We'd worry about trauma and lost childhood and emotional development. But in his context, these lessons kept him alive, and they made him into a person who could later keep others alive. By the time spring came and his father recovered, Skanawati had been transformed. Not just more skilled, but mentally different. He had faced genuine responsibility with real consequences, and succeeded. He had learned that he was capable of more than he thought possible. That winter made him a leader. By the time he was 20, people sought his advice on survival matters. By 30, he was a respected elder despite his relative youth. By the time he died at 72, his name was synonymous with wisdom about winter survival. Would he have become that person without the childhood hardship? Maybe. Or maybe that winter crisis developed capabilities that easier circumstances never could have created. This is the uncomfortable question at the heart of these children's stories. Did hardship make them stronger? Or did it just reveal strength they already had? Modern developmental psychology suggests that moderate challenges help children develop resilience, but excessive stress creates trauma. So which was historical winter survival? Moderate challenge or excessive stress? The answer probably varied. Some children thrived, learned quickly, found satisfaction in mastery, grew into capable adults who passed their knowledge forward. Others broke, children who couldn't handle the responsibility, who made mistakes that cost lives or resources, who grew into adults carrying deep wounds from childhood experiences of genuine life or death pressure. The historical record preserves stories of the successful children, the ones who learned and survived and contributed to their communities, but it's mostly silent about the ones who didn't make it. The children who died from exposure or accident, or who simply couldn't develop the skills fast enough. Winter survival had a failure rate. Not everyone made it. And children with their smaller bodies and incomplete skill development were especially vulnerable. One account from early contact period describes a winter where a community lost 4 children to cold-related illness. Not from neglect or lack of care, from the simple reality that children's immune systems weren't strong enough to resist infections that winter stress made more likely. Another account describes a child who wandered away from camp during a storm. Searchers found him the next day, frozen, less than a quarter mile from safety. He had gotten disoriented in the whiteout and couldn't find his way back. These stories are harder to hear. They remind us that this wasn't a romantic adventure. It was real life with real stakes where people, including children, died. So when we talk about what children learn during winter, we have to remember that some children never got the chance to finish their education. That survival knowledge was purchased partly with the lives of children who were still learning when winter claimed them. But for those who survived, the education was remarkable. They learned patience from waiting for ice to form thick enough to walk on safely. They learned observation from tracking animals and predicting weather. They learned problem solving from figuring out how to accomplish tasks with limited tools and materials. They learned cooperation from understanding that survival required everyone contributing. They learned resilience from facing genuine hardship and discovering they could endure it. They learned respect for nature from living in intimate daily contact with forces that could kill them if they made mistakes. These weren't lessons from books or lectures. They were lessons from experience, from cold that numbed your fingers while you worked, from hunger that gnawed at you while you tried to sleep, from fear that whispered in the dark while you listened to wind that might bring storm or might just be wind. And perhaps most importantly, they learned the value of knowledge itself. They understood in their bones that knowing things, real practical knowledge, made the difference between life and death. Coming up, we're going to address something that most histories avoid: the inequality that existed even in survival situations. How some families had advantage while others struggled. How winter revealed and reinforced social hierarchies. The dark truth about who was most likely to survive and who was most likely to become winter's price. But before we go there, I want to ask you to share this video with someone who works with children. Teachers, parents, coaches, anyone who thinks about childhood development. These historical perspectives on what children can learn and how they can contribute offer interesting contrast to modern assumptions. Now, let's talk about the uncomfortable reality of privilege during survival seasons. Chapter 8. The Dark Truth About Winter. Privilege. Not everyone experienced winter the same way. This is a truth that many romantic accounts of historical survival gloss over. They tell stories of communities working together, sharing resources, surviving through cooperation. All of that is true, but it's not the complete truth. Some people had advantages, better shelters, more food, superior clothing, protection from the worst hardships, and these advantages often determined who lived and who died. Let me describe two longhouses in the same community. Same winter, same conditions. The first longhouse is home to an ordinary family, 6 people sharing a space barely large enough for them all. Their food stores are adequate if the winter is normal, dangerously insufficient if it's harsh. Their clothing is functional but not optimal. Their shelter keeps out the worst of the wind but doesn't maintain warmth effectively. They survive winter through careful rationing, constant vigilance, and acceptance that they will be cold and hungry for months. Children will go to sleep with growling stomachs. Adults will make calculations about whether to burn enough wood to stay comfortable or conserve fuel and endure cold. The second longhouse is home to a leadership family. More space per person. Food stores that represent genuine abundance, not just adequacy. Clothing made from the finest materials, crafted with the most skill. A shelter that incorporates sophisticated heating and ventilation systems. They experience winter differently. Not comfortably by modern standards, but without the grinding desperation that characterized the first family's experience. Their children don't go to bed truly hungry. Their adults don't lie awake calculating whether food will last. Same community, same winter. Profoundly different experiences. How did this happen? Why did communities that depended on cooperation allow such inequality? The answer is complex. Leadership families had advantages partly because communities invested in them. Better shelters meant leaders stayed healthy and capable of making good decisions. More food meant they had the energy for the mental work of managing community resources. Better clothing meant they could travel for diplomacy or coordination when weather made travel dangerous. In a sense, leadership privilege was an investment in community capacity. You want your decision makers well fed and rested so they make better decisions. You want them equipped to handle responsibilities that ordinary members couldn't or wouldn't want to take on. but investments can become entitlements. Privileges justified by function can become privileges maintained through power. The line between we support our leaders so they can serve better and leaders take more because they can is easy to cross. And winter was when this tension became most visible. When resources were scarce and survival uncertain, the difference between adequate and abundant supplies wasn't just comfort, it was life and death. Here's a story that illustrates this tension. In the winter of 1462, a community faced severe food shortages. The supplies that should have been adequate weren't. A combination of poor harvest, failed hunting, and longer than expected winter created genuine crisis. The community leader, call him Tadodaho, had to make decisions about rationing. He's implemented a system where everyone received reduced portions based on age, health, and contribution to survival work. But observers from outside the leadership household noticed something. The leader's family portions, while reduced, weren't reduced as much as everyone else's. They were still eating better than ordinary families. Was this justified? Did the leader need more food because his work required more energy? Or was he protecting his own family while asking others to sacrifice more? Different community members had different opinions. Some supported their leader, trusting his judgment and accepting that leadership came with certain privileges. Others resented what they saw as unfair advantage during a time when everyone should share equally. The tension never exploded into open conflict, but it created divisions that lasted beyond that winter. Trust was damaged. Questions about fairness and leadership legitimacy persisted. This story isn't unique. Variations of it appeared in communities across native North America. The basic tension between leadership privilege and community equality played out in different ways depending on cultural values, specific leaders, and particular circumstances. Some communities maintained relatively egalitarian structures even during winter. Leadership was consensual and temporary. Resources were shared broadly. Privilege was minimized. These communities survived through very high levels of cooperation and trust. Other communities developed more hierarchical structures. Leadership was hereditary or earned through demonstrated capability. Resources were distributed unequally, with leaders receiving larger shares. Privilege was accepted as necessary for effective governance. These communities survived through organization and coordination that strong leadership enabled. Neither system was clearly superior. Both worked under the right conditions, both failed under the wrong conditions, both created their own tensions and challenges. But here's what makes this topic controversial today. How do we judge these historical inequalities? By modern standards, the idea of leaders eating better while community members go hungry is morally repugnant. Equality during crisis seems like an obvious ethical requirement, but judged by survival outcomes, leadership privilege sometimes created better results. Communities with well-resourced leaders sometimes survived better than communities where everyone shared equal hardship. So do we judge by moral principles or by practical outcomes? Do we evaluate historical practices by modern ethics or by the standards of their own time and circumstances? There's no simple answer. But refusing to acknowledge that the tension existed creates an incomplete picture of historical survival. It makes it seem like cooperation was easy and natural, when actually it required constant negotiation of competing interests and values, and it erases the experiences of people who are on the wrong side of privilege. Families who watched their children go hungry while leadership families maintained comfort. Individuals who worked hard but received less because they lacked social status or family connections. Their stories matter too. Not just the stories of successful leaders and cooperative communities, but the stories of people who survived despite disadvantage. who faced winter with fewer resources and less support, but somehow endured. Coming up next, we are going to explore what happened when winter overwhelmed everyone, regardless of privilege. When neither knowledge nor organisation nor stored resources were enough. The dark nights when communities faced the reality that some people were going to die and had to decide who and how. This is the hardest part of the story, but it's also the most important for understanding what winter survival really meant. But before we continue into that darkness, take a moment to leave a comment. What do you think about privilege during survival crises? Should resources be shared equally, or does practical leadership require advantage? I'm genuinely curious about different perspectives. Now, let's step into the worst night, the crisis that no preparation could prevent. Chapter 9, Fear the Night. Everything went wrong. This chapter contains difficult content. It's the reality that most histories avoid because it's uncomfortable. But understanding what happened when everything went wrong is essential for appreciating both the success stories and the stakes involved. The winter of 1456 in the region around Lake Huron became known as the Winter of No Spring. Not because spring didn't come, but because it came so late that many didn't survive to see it. Let me tell you what happened to one community when winter overwhelmed all their preparations. The community had done everything right. Adequate food stores, good shelters, experienced leadership, strong cooperation. By all reasonable planning, they should have survived comfortably. But the snow started in October and didn't stop. By November, accumulation was deeper than anyone had seen in living memory. By December, hunting became impossible. Stored food that should have lasted until March was being consumed faster than planned because the extreme cold required more calories. By January, they knew they were in trouble. Rations were reduced, non-essential activities were eliminated. Everyone focused entirely on survival. By February, they were starving. Not hungry, starving. The kind of hunger that consumes your body from inside, that makes every movement require conscious effort, that turns thinking into a slow, difficult process. And the snow kept coming, and spring kept not arriving, and people started dying. The first deaths were the very old and very young. Bodies that couldn't handle the combination of cold and starvation. These deaths were sad but somewhat expected. Elders and infants were always the most vulnerable, but then healthier people started dying. A woman in her 30s simply didn't wake up one morning. A teenage boy went to gather wood and collapsed in the snow. His body was found hours later, frozen. The community had to make decisions that no one should ever have to make. Who gets the last food? Who gets priority for the warmest sleeping positions? When someone is dying, do you share resources trying to save them or conserve those resources for people more likely to survive? These aren't abstract ethical questions. These were decisions that real people faced while watching their family members waste away. And different people made different choices, creating moral complexity that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. One family shared their last food with a dying grandmother, even though they knew it wouldn't save her. They chose compassion over survival advantage. They all died. Another family made the opposite choice. When it became clear that the youngest child was failing, they reduced his portions and distributed them to stronger family members. The child died, but the rest of the family survived. Those survivors carried guilt for decades. Which choice was right? Modern ethics would condemn the second family for letting a child die. But their choice meant survival for multiple people. Their grandchildren exist because they made a horrible decision that allowed the family line to continue. The community's leader faced the worst decision of all. They'd reached a point where there was no more food, nothing stored, nothing that could be gathered. They were weeks from spring, and people were dying daily. Someone suggested something that until that moment had been unthinkable, that some members of the community should leave. Walk away in search of other communities that might have food to share. It was a suicide mission. Travel in deep winter, already weakened by starvation, with no clear destination, was almost certainly fatal. But staying meant everyone would die. At least if some people left, the remaining food would last longer for those who stayed, and the travellers might possibly find help and save themselves. The leader had to choose who would go. It was framed as volunteers, but everyone understood it was really a death sentence. Who volunteers for death? Young men without children stepped forward. If anyone could survive the journey, it would be them, and their deaths would cost the community less than losing mothers or elders with critical knowledge. They left at dawn, 7 young men walking into storm with almost no supplies and fading hope. 3 of them made it to a neighbouring community 30 miles away. Those 3 brought back help that arrived just in time to save the people who had stayed. 4 died in the snow. Their frozen bodies were found weeks later when spring finally melted the drifts that had become their graves. This story isn't unique. Variations of it played out across native North America in harsh winters when preparation wasn't enough and knowledge couldn't overcome the simple reality of insufficient food and too much cold. These stories usually don't get told. They're too dark, too uncomfortable. They don't fit narratives about successful survival or harmonious communities or ancient wisdom, but they're part of the truth. Winter survival wasn't always successful. Knowledge and preparation improved odds, but they didn't guarantee outcomes. Sometimes, despite doing everything right, people died. And sometimes survival required making choices that violated everything these communities believed about how to treat each other. Choices that survivors questioned for the rest of their lives. What can we learn from these dark stories? What good comes from knowing about suffering and death and impossible decisions? Maybe just this, that survival was real, not romantic, not an adventure story, not an example to idealize, but a genuine struggle where people faced circumstances that tested everything they believed about themselves and each other. The people who survived these extreme winters weren't heroes in a simple sense. They were humans who endured conditions that broke some people and shaped others in ways both good and terrible. They made compromises. They lived with guilt. They carried scars, physical and emotional, that never fully healed. They remembered the ones who didn't make it and wondered if different choices might have saved them. But they also discovered something about human capacity, that people can endure more than seems possible, that communities can hold together even when circumstances try to tear them apart, that hope can survive even in the darkest moments when survival itself seems impossible. Coming up, we'll explore what happened to all that survival knowledge, where it went, why it disappeared, and whether it matters that we lost it. But for now, take a moment to breathe. That was heavy. If you need to pause. This content isn't going anywhere. Your emotional well-being matters more than finishing a video. When you're ready, we'll continue. But there's no rush. Winter waited for no one, but this story will wait for you. Chapter 10. The Knowledge That Vanished Forever. In 1924, an ethnographer named James Reynolds interviewed an elderly Ojibwe woman named Nokomis. She was 93 years old. She had lived her childhood in traditional ways, experiencing winters that required all the survival knowledge we've been discussing. Reynolds asked her to teach him how to make proper winter moccasins. She agreed. He watched carefully, took detailed notes, made drawings, photographed each step. He thought he had documented the process completely. Years later, craftspeople tried to follow his documentation. They produced moccasins that looked authentic, but when tested in real winter conditions, they didn't perform as well as historical examples. Water leaked in, insulation shifted. Something was wrong. What had been missed? What had Nokomis known that didn't get captured in the notes and drawings? Nobody knows. She died in 1926. The knowledge died with her. And despite all the documentation, despite the careful observation, something essential was lost. This story represents a larger tragedy. The loss of knowledge systems developed over thousands of years. Not because the knowledge didn't work, but because the conditions that maintained it changed faster than it could be preserved. Let's talk about how knowledge disappears. It's not usually dramatic. No book burnings, no deliberate destruction, just quiet obsolescence as conditions change and old knowledge seems less relevant. For native winter survival knowledge, the change started with European contact. Not immediately, not completely, but gradually in ways that seemed helpful at the time but created dependence that eventually displaced traditional knowledge. Metal tools arrived. They were better than stone and bone tools in many ways. Sharper, more durable, easier to use. Communities that acquired metal tools understandably preferred them. Stone tool making knowledge became less critical, still practiced but not by everyone, then practiced by specialists, then by elderly people remembering old ways, then forgotten. Wool blankets arrived. They were easier to acquire than processing enough hides for winter clothing. They worked reasonably well for warmth. Not as well as traditional clothing systems in some ways, but well enough. The complex knowledge of hide preparation, fur processing, and garment construction became less essential. Fewer people learned it. Eventually, almost no one knew the complete process. Guns arrived. Hunting became more efficient in some ways. But the traditional knowledge of tracking, of understanding animal behavior, of getting close enough for bow hunting, that knowledge became less critical when you could shoot from a distance. It wasn't forgotten immediately, but it was practiced less. Skills that aren't practiced regularly are skills that fade. At first, these changes seemed positive. Life became easier in some ways, less labor-intensive, more reliable in certain respects. People could acquire what they needed through trade rather than creating everything themselves. But trade created dependence. When you rely on trade goods, you need access to trade networks. You need things to trade. You need relationships with traders. You become vulnerable to disruptions in trade that you have no control over. And gradually, traditional knowledge that seemed obsolete when trade goods were available became critical knowledge that no longer existed when trade networks failed. This pattern repeated across native North America. Different timing, different specific details, but the same basic story. Adoption of new technologies that worked well under certain conditions but created dependence that replaced traditional self-sufficiency. By the early 20th century, when ethnographers like Reynolds started trying to document traditional knowledge, much of it was already gone or existed only in fragmented form remembered by elderly people who had learned in childhood but hadn't practiced in decades. The ethnographers did valuable work. They preserved some knowledge that would otherwise have been completely lost, but they couldn't capture everything. Knowledge embedded in daily practice, in muscle memory, in subtle judgment calls that practitioners couldn't fully articulate because they had become automatic. And sometimes the problem was translation itself. How do you describe in English a technique developed in a language with different categories and concepts? How do you write down knowledge that was meant to be demonstrated and practiced rather than verbalized? Some of what was lost we can identify. We know certain techniques existed because historical accounts describe them, or surviving examples demonstrate them. We just can't fully recreate them. Other knowledge disappeared so completely we don't even know it existed. Entire categories of survival techniques that were so effective they seemed unremarkable, and therefore weren't described in detail. Knowledge so common that no one thought to document it because everyone already knew it. Until suddenly, they didn't. And then it was too late. Here's what makes this particularly tragic. Much of this knowledge is becoming relevant again, not because we're going back to pre-contact lifestyles, but because the principles behind historical survival techniques offer insights for modern challenges. Sustainable resource management, low-impact technologies, understanding of environmental patterns, psychological resilience techniques. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're wisdom that might help address current problems, but recovering lost knowledge is incredibly difficult, sometimes impossible. You can research, you can experiment, you can consult with remaining practitioners of traditional knowledge, but you can't recreate thousands of years of refinement and accumulated wisdom. Some Indigenous communities have worked to preserve and revive traditional knowledge. Language revitalization programs that preserve the categories and concepts through which traditional knowledge was understood. Cultural education that teaches younger generations what elders still remember. Practical skills programs that combine traditional techniques with modern understanding. These efforts are valuable but face challenges. The context that gave traditional knowledge meaning have changed. The daily practice that maintained skill levels no longer exists. The integration of knowledge into complete lifestyle systems is difficult to recreate in modern circumstances. You can teach someone to make fire by hand, but teaching that skill in isolation, without the context of why and when and how it fits into larger survival strategies, creates different knowledge than traditional practitioners had. It's like the difference between learning individual words in a language versus actually speaking that language fluently. You might learn the words, but without the grammar, the idioms, the cultural context, you're not really speaking the language. So what do we do with this loss? How do we think about knowledge that disappeared before we recognized its value? Some people focus on preservation, trying to document what remains before it's too late. Others focus on revival, teaching traditional skills and hoping to regenerate living practice. Still others focus on adaptation, taking principles from traditional knowledge and applying them in modern contexts. All approaches have value, all face challenges, and all arrive too late for much of what was lost. Coming up in our final chapters, we'll explore what lessons from historical winter survival might matter for modern life. What wisdom survived the knowledge loss? What principles might help us face our own challenges even though our circumstances are completely different? But before we get there, subscribe if you haven't already. These deep explorations into historical knowledge systems take time to research and create. Your subscription helps me continue making them. Now, let's talk about what winter taught people that might still matter today. Chapter 11. What winter taught them that we forgot. There's a concept in ecology called shifting baseline syndrome. Each generation assumes that the environmental conditions they experienced in childhood are normal. They don't realize that normal has changed, that what seems ordinary to them would have seemed degraded to their grandparents. The same thing happens with human capabilities. Each generation assumes that what people can do now represents normal human capacity. We don't recognize how much capability has been lost because we never experienced it directly. Historical winter survival reveals capabilities that seem almost superhuman by the modern standards. Not because the people were superhuman, but because our baseline for normal human capability has shifted downward. Let me give you specific examples that make this clear. Temperature tolerance. Modern survival guidelines say that you need shelter when temperature drops below freezing, that hypothermia risk becomes serious below 30 degrees, that temperatures below zero are extremely dangerous even with modern gear. But historical populations routinely lived and worked in conditions that modern guidelines would call unsurvivable. They weren't just surviving, they were functioning, travelling, working, maintaining normal daily activities in temperatures that modern people consider emergencies requiring immediate shelter. What changed? Did human biology change? Not significantly. What changed was capability developed through lifelong conditioning and knowledge. From childhood, native peoples in cold climates were gradually exposed to cold in Hoindi, ways that developed physiological and psychological adaptations. Cold wasn't an emergency, it was normal. Their bodies learned to maintain function in conditions that unconditioned bodies can't handle. Modern people rarely develop this conditioning. We go from heated homes to heated cars to heated buildings. Cold is always an aberration to be avoided. Our bodies never learn that they can adapt and function in conditions that we now consider intolerable. Pain tolerance is another area where baselines have shifted dramatically. Modern people seek medical treatment for levels of discomfort that historical populations considered ordinary and not worth mentioning. This isn't because modern people are weak or soft, it's because our experience of what's normal is different. When medical treatment is available, seeking it for discomfort makes sense. When it's not available, you learn to function through levels of discomfort that would send modern people to the emergency room. Historical winter survival required functioning through constant low-level pain, cold that numbed extremities, hunger that gnawed continuously, physical exhaustion from labour and inadequate rest. This wasn't occasional, it was daily reality for months. People adapted, not by becoming immune to pain, but by learning to function despite it, by separating the sensation of pain from the decision about how to respond to it. Modern pain management focuses on eliminating pain, which makes sense when that's possible. But historical pain management focused on functioning despite pain, which was necessary when elimination wasn't possible. Neither approach is inherently better. They are adapted to different circumstances, but recognizing that human pain tolerance is far higher than modern experience suggests could be valuable information for situations where pain elimination isn't immediately available. Hunger tolerance is perhaps the most dramatic shift in baseline. Modern nutrition guidelines emphasize regular meals and consistent calorie intake. Missing a single meal is considered a hardship worth complaining about. Historical winter survival involved months of inadequate nutrition. Not starvation, but genuine hunger that never went away. Bodies adapted by becoming more efficient. Metabolism slowed, activity levels decreased. The body learned to function on fewer calories than modern nutrition science says is possible. Again, this isn't better than adequate nutrition. Chronic hunger has real costs, but understanding that human bodies can adapt to scarcity more effectively than we typically assume could be relevant for situations where adequate nutrition isn't available. But perhaps the most important lesson from historical winter survival isn't physical, it's psychological. Modern life has created expectations about comfort, convenience, and immediate gratification that would have been incomprehensible to historical populations. We expect problems to have solutions, discomfort to be temporary, help to be available. Historical winter survival required accepting circumstances that couldn't be changed, enduring conditions that wouldn't improve until seasons shifted, making the best of situations that offered no good options. This isn't fatalism, it's pragmatic acceptance of reality. You can't change the weather, you can't make spring arrive early, you can't create food that doesn't exist. So you accept what you can't change, and focus your energy on what you can influence. Modern psychology often treats acceptance as giving up, as passive resignation that prevents positive change. But historical winter survival shows that acceptance can coexist with action. You accept that winter is harsh while actively working to survive it. You accept that resources are limited while creatively finding ways to extend them. The difference is subtle but important. Modern problem-solving tends to fight against circumstances, trying to overcome them through effort and innovation. Historical problem-solving more often worked with circumstances, finding ways to function within constraints rather than breaking through them. Neither approach is always appropriate. Sometimes fighting circumstances is exactly what you should do, but modern culture has perhaps overemphasized fighting and underemphasized adaptive acceptance. Winter taught people that some problems don't have solutions, they have responses. You can't solve winter. You can only respond to it effectively. You can't solve scarcity beyond a certain point. You can only manage it wisely. These lessons feel relevant now. Climate change, economic instability, pandemic disruptions. These are problems that don't have simple solutions, that require adaptation and resilience more than conquest and elimination. The people who survived historical winters weren't conquerors who dominated nature. They were adapters who learned to live within natural limits, who developed wisdom about working with constraints rather than only fighting against them. That wisdom seems valuable now, not as a reason to accept injustice or stop trying to improve things, but as a complement to fighting, a recognition that some challenges require adaptation as much as solution. Coming up in our final chapter, we'll bring this journey to a close. We'll talk about what happened when spring finally came, what it meant to survive, what the cost was, and what the people who made it through carried forward from the experience. But right now, leave a comment sharing what lesson from historical survival feels most relevant to your life. What capability do you wish modern people still had? I read every comment, and these discussions add so much value. Now, let's finish this journey us together. Let's talk about spring. Chapter 12, the final lesson of spring. The first sign is subtle, a slight softening in the air, a change in light that's more feeling than fact. The snow that has been frozen solid for months develops, a slight crust that melts in afternoon sun. Spring isn't an arrival, it's a gradual transformation. Day by day, barely noticeable changes that accumulate into certainty. For people who have survived winter on the edge of endurance, these changes carry emotional weight that's difficult to describe. Hope that had been carefully rationed suddenly feels safer to express. Bodies that have been tense with constant survival effort begin to relax. But spring also brings new challenges. Bodies weakened by winter can't immediately handle abundance. Stomachs that have shrunk through months of inadequate food can't process large meals. The transition from scarcity to plenty must be managed carefully, or the abundance that should save you can make you sick. And there's grief. All winter you focused on survival. There was no space for processing loss, no energy for mourning. The people who died, whether family members or community members, were mourned briefly, and then you moved forward because dwelling on loss used energy you needed for living. But when spring comes and survival is assured, the grief that was postponed arrives fully. You can finally acknowledge what winter cost, who didn't make it, what was lost that can't be recovered. Communities that survived winter together had changed. Relationships that were tested revealed their true strength or weakness. People who showed themselves capable under pressure gained respect. People who failed under pressure lost status. The social recalibrations that followed winter could be almost as stressful as winter itself, but they were necessary. Communities needed to integrate what they'd learned about themselves and each other during the hardest months. And there was the knowledge that it would happen again. Winter would return. In 8 months, you'd be back in the same struggle, the same cold, The same scarcity, the same questions about whether you'd survive to see another spring. This cyclical nature of the challenge created different psychology than one-time crises create. You couldn't tell yourself, I just have to get through this and then it's over. Because it was never over, it just paused for a season before returning. This created a particular kind of resilience, not the resilience of crisis survival, but the resilience of sustained adaptation, of building practices and knowledge that worked repeatedly, of creating communities that could endure not just once, but generation after generation, and it created wisdom about acceptance, about living with challenges that couldn't be permanently solved, about finding satisfaction in survival itself rather than only in triumph. There's something profound about cultures built around seasonal extremes. They developed philosophies that accepted hardship as fundamental rather than aberrant, that found meaning in endurance itself, that celebrated survival as achievement worth honouring. Modern culture, by contrast, tends to see hardship as something that should be eliminated, as evidence of failure rather than opportunity for meaning. We celebrate overcoming challenges, but tend to view ongoing challenges as problems that haven't been solved yet rather than as fundamental conditions of existence. The winter survivors knew better. They understood that some challenges are permanent parts of life. That wisdom comes from learning to meet them repeatedly with grace and skill, rather than from eliminating them entirely. This doesn't mean we shouldn't try to reduce suffering. Of course we should. But it suggests that complete elimination of hardship might not be possible, or even desirable, that some struggle might be essential for developing capabilities we value. The children who grew up experiencing winter hardship became adults with knowledge and resilience that easier childhoods couldn't provide. The communities that survived winter together developed bonds and capabilities that abundant societies didn't need. There was a cost, real suffering, real loss, lives cut short, potential unfulfilled. But there was also something gained, something that modern comfort might be losing without recognizing the loss. As you lie here tonight, comfortable and warm with every need met, consider what was purchased by that comfort. What capabilities were traded away for convenience? What knowledge was forgotten when it stopped being essential? This isn't about romanticizing the past. Winter survival was genuinely hard. People suffered in ways we can barely imagine. No one should have to live like that, but perhaps there's wisdom in remembering, in understanding what humans are capable of when necessity demands it, in recognizing that the comfort we enjoy is historically anomalous and potentially fragile. Climate change might bring new challenges that require adaptation skills our culture has forgotten. Economic disruptions might create scarcity that demands the kind of resource management that historical populations mastered. Social changes might require the community resilience that winter survival developed. If and when those challenges arrive, the wisdom of historical winter survivors might become relevant again. Not the specific techniques, most of which are obsolete, but the principles behind them. The psychological resilience, the community cooperation, the acceptance of hardship combined with determination to endure it. These people, our ancestors, faced conditions that would defeat most of us today. And they didn't just survive, they built thriving cultures. They raised children who became the next generation of survivors. They created knowledge systems sophisticated enough to maintain survival across thousands of years. That's remarkable. That's worth remembering. That's wisdom we shouldn't lose completely, even though we hope never to need it. As spring emerged for those winter survivors all those centuries ago, they felt something we rarely experience, the profound satisfaction of having endured, of having faced genuine trial and not broken, of belonging to a community that held together under conditions that tested every bond. They had proven something to themselves, to each other, to the winter itself. They were capable, they were resilient, they were worthy of the spring that had finally mercifully arrived. And in the quiet warmth of these late spring days, before the busy abundance of summer began, they rested, they healed, they prepared for the next cycle, and they told stories about the winter just ended, transforming suffering into narrative, creating meaning from endurance. Those stories were told to children who would need them when their own winter arrived, passed to community members who would carry the knowledge forward, shared with neighbours who would learn from their experience. The suffering became teaching, the loss became wisdom, the survival became hope for future generations, and now, centuries later, their story has been shared with you. Not because you'll need to survive winter without modern technology, but because the principles they learned might still matter, because human resilience is worth celebrating, because wisdom can survive even when specific knowledge is lost. If this journey has meant something to you, share it with someone else. Leave a like to show you value this kind of deep exploration into history's lessons. Subscribe so you'll be here for the next journey into forgotten wisdom. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening to stories of people whose names we mostly don't know but whose lives matter, for caring about wisdom that's in danger of being completely forgotten. Sleep well tonight, warm and comfortable, and maybe spare a thought for those who slept cold but survived anyway, who faced winters that would kill us but somehow endured, who proved that humans are capable of more than we typically imagine. Spring always came eventually, even when it seemed impossible, even when hope was barely a whisper. Spring came, and it will come again. Whatever winters you face, personal or collective, spring will come again. Rest well, friends. The story is complete, but the wisdom endures. Until next time, carry forward what matters from this journey through winter's teachings. And remember that you're capable of more than you know, just like they were. Good night.